It's a great privilege for me to be here because my go-to for any kind of Kilidi related research was Soumya, and her go-to was Dr. Sharda. So it's wonderful for me to be here on the stage. I'm essentially going to be a prop and let them do most of the speaking. But I want to start with you because you've gone to Kilidi much before the spotlight was put. It wasn't as popular, it wasn't as controversial, dare I say. Uh, so what were your first impressions when you went to KD? Because this wasn't your first such site. You've been to many others in other parts of the country. So how was KLD different and what were your first impressions?
Uh, Thank you, Pooja, and all of you for this opportunity. First of all, before I answer that, I should, of course, congratulate our writer, young writer, on on the book, which is a very a very for me, it had a lot of resonance because I could see myself, traveling to sites and all that. So she evoked so much of the landscape that I had been visiting. And it also, I mean, the title itself, The Dig, I was, of course, reminded of, the book, which is inspired by, I mean, the film, which is inspired by the Sutton Hoo excavations, where, this wonderful royal ship burial is found right in somebody's, inside their backyard, so to speak. And also because I think, that gentle humor which she uses and that anecdotal style, it also reminds us that, we need not, I mean, even for me, it resonates for me that one needn't take history and, the scientific study of the past or the study of the past, that seriously, because these are all, I think, in a way, piecemeal, and of course, they all add to various interpretations, but at the end we can never actually know the reality of the past totally in totality. So it is very much a kind of a quantum mechanical rather than a deterministic process. I think it's the wave, it's the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It is an observer created reality which way. So let's start with agreeing that this is the past really needs to be enjoyed, and really that's what I took away from Soumya's. It brought back some of my own enjoyment in my journey, not about, what exactly is found, not found, and actually going and talking to people and traveling to places and so on. So in that sense, Kiradi, yes, I was there in 2018. And, what struck, strikes, what really resonated with Kiradi, of course, I'm also, share part Tamil lineage, also, of course, in Bangalore and so on. But, because when I began my studies in the late 80s, we always thought of, that civilization in South India or Tamil Nadu starts with the medieval period, the Cholas, the great Cholas and the Chola masterpieces, the South Indian bronzes, and that there was really nothing much else going on before that. It was just a sudden efflorescence. And then, of course, there were, in those days already in the 90s, Dr. Rajan, who's really been one of the prime moving forces of archaeology in Tamil Nadu, Dr. Rajan Nagaswamy, and so on. So Dr. Rajan at that time had, of course, undertaken important excavations in Kodumanal, which was a burial cum habitation site, and I was getting interested there in the analysis of the metal and so on. And then, of course, with Kiridi, that was, of course, a game changer because, for the first time, you're actually seeing, remnants which speak to us in terms of the urbanized context. When you went to Kiridi, it was actually very moving because we always thought of South Indian civilization as not having anything, as I said, that goes back that far back, which is of that kind of, civilizational level. Of course, we'll come to the burials, urn burials, but that's a different story. And just seeing those paved streets and then seeing the ring wells and all of those aspects. And of course, before that, in the early 2000s, I had made a couple of field visits to Dholavira, which is a Harappan site in the Rann of Kutch, which is, of course, very spectacular. And Dholavira, of course, is much earlier into his Harappan and so on. And, you have this great sense of this huge settlement and the citadel and the use of the stone, rather than brick, which you were seeing in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the stone technology and so on, which was, and of course, Kiridi is bricks. But yes, there is that sense of, walking somewhere which had, all of this, these urbanized features of a much more complex civilization than we associate. And of course, Kiradi is associated with the second urbanization. The dates are from about 6th century BC, from the AMS dating and so on. But still, it was very exciting to see that. And at the same time, there were some very curious aspects too, because the fact that you do see that in this sign 365 there, the sign which looks like that on a potsherd, and I saw that right there, and then some of the dice and the so on, which we could see right there. So it was, of course, second urbanization and so on, but still these echoes were lingering in our minds. What is the connection and so on. So there was all this excitement which was building up there. Anyway, I won't. Please, over to you.
I think that one thing that you said, that we can't take this too seriously to a point where we are so certain about what we think we know. That's, I think, a message we can give to people across the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
But before I go across to Soumya, here's something I want to do as a journalist, as a fellow journalist. She's too shy to do this, but I would urge every one of you to pick up this book. Don't borrow other people's book and read. Pick up a copy, because it's such a struggle for journalists to pick on a topic. Every other day, we're just running from one thing to the other, and we're equally excited about all of them. To pick one thing and to write, and she's given this months and years of her life. Let's start with that. Why did you choose to write this? Because, like in your introduction, we learned you've done a whole lot of things. Why this?
First of all, thank you so much for everyone who's here. Thank you to BIC and to the two of you for agreeing to do this. It's my first time speaking in BIC, and I'm really in awe of everybody showing up. Bangalore traffic is crazy. I was stuck in traffic before, so thanks for coming. Why did I choose this? I think it's the wonderful situation we find ourselves as journalists, that we can write about anything we want. And it so happened, and I've said this before, and I'm sorry if anyone here has heard me before, I happened to be sitting at home, peak lockdown, and I got a call asking me to pitch a story for a long form piece. And I said, give me a couple of days. And I thought about it, and I phoned this editor in Bombay and said, there are these excavations that happened about 5 years ago. I have no idea what happened to them. Can I look into it? And the other editor on the call was like, absolutely, I want to know what happened too. So it was an initial spark thanks to a long form piece. And I am a long form writer. I've always enjoyed spending time with stories, researching them, speaking to people. Of course, the foundation has been newspaper reporting for 15 years, but every time I got a chance to write something longer, it was always more satisfying. So it started off with that specific piece. It did really well, Tamils and outside Tamil Nadu. And I shelved it. I never thought of it as a book. I spent most of 2021 phoning publishers, confidently pitching all kinds of things which I had no expertise on. And they said to me, yeah, there's no way you're going to be allowed or given money to do this. And I guess, like the serendipitous discovery of Kiladi, someone phoned me one day and gave me the idea for this book. And it was a literary agent who said, if you're going to write about this, we want to support you on this. And suddenly it became from an idea to a book proposal that went to a bunch of publishers who said, yeah, we want this book. So it really just happened quite randomly. And before I knew it, I was in the thick of the Kiladi world. And the first time I visited was actually lockdown, December 2020. And I was super excited. In my mind, it was what I had seen online, right? This like large sort of township and people milling about and potsherds being cleaned, and I found nothing. It was a quiet coconut grove and one archaeologist had left his tent behind. So I took many photos of that tent thinking this is the closest I get to an excavation. But I went back multiple times after, and it started to resemble more and more of how I thought it was going to look like. And I think if you haven't been to Kiladi, I'll urge everyone to go. The quaintness of the coconut grove does something to you. It really pulls you in. And if you're familiar with Ilayaraja songs, I immediately had one of those songs playing in my mind as in the second chapter, I write about following a very grumpy person who's a landowner around the grove. And here I'm thinking these beautiful songs, and he's just like, what do you want? And like, yeah, it happened here, it happened there. Can you just leave? I have to get to work. So it was this sort of wonderful in my head, this playing of like fact and fiction in a way. And like Sharda ma'am just said, I'm not supposed to call you ma'am, sorry. Sharda said, we do have a certain romanticizing nature to the past, and this sort of fed into that for me, and it was really wonderful.
I'm a new entrant to the Kildi world. My first visit was, I think, in June or July of this year, and I was blown away. I didn't know what to expect. I'd seen visuals and pictures of it, but being there in that hot sun is something else. Before we get into the technical part of it, I also want to talk a little bit about the people there, right? Because yes, the narrative is grand around it, but for the people who have to stand in that sun day on day, take a small, it's when we say the dig, nobody is actually digging there, right? It's very delicate work. They take a paintbrush and they're going through layers millimeter by millimeter. So what was your experience like when you spoke to people there for whom this has become their lives for almost 10 years now, some of them?
Absolutely. And I think at Kiladi, you have the entire village that has come out, and not just Kiladi. If you go to any excavation site in India, the labor comes from the village, the people who live close to the excavation site. And when they showed up, at least in Kiladi, there was a lot of changes that happened, good and bad. In the sense, there was suspicion. Here you have a bunch of archaeologists coming from outside that village. Are they good people? Can we trust them? The reality on the ground in India, and which we don't speak enough about, is the caste realities. So somebody might not want somebody else to work on their ground. But I found wonderful stories where people became friends in these excavation sites. Perhaps those lines became more defined as soon as the work wrapped up at 5 p.m. and they went home. But while they were hanging out, there was always like conversation and laughter. And I write about this in the book, but there's a particular afternoon I spent with an archaeologist at Kiladi. And when there's peak sun, I think it's between like 2 and 4, or no, 1 and 3, I think, people take a break because it's just too hot to dig. And so you can see around the grove, people taking a nap in different spots. And I watched this man at 3 o'clock be a self-appointed alarm clock. So he gets up and he says, 3 p.m., Munamani, Munamani, Munamani. And so everyone's like back to work, right? So, and I saw this in multiple excavations, that there is that one person who's kind of reminding the others, okay, back to work. And to them, many of them, it was a sense of pride. It was a sense of ownership to who these people were, whether it's a habitation site or a burial. There was a claim that these were my people, or some people said, I actually don't know who they are. One person commented on the wonderful sort of teeth sample or something she'd seen, and she was wondering whether they use neem leaves to brush, or like, how did this work? And she said, I've fallen off my scooty and I broke my limbs, but this skeleton is intact. How did that happen? And there are all these different versions of how people imagine what this is. And in the Kondagai site, which is a burial site close to Kiladi, the archaeologist there told me she gets a tailor called Kadiresan to come and like really do the section drawings beautifully to, cut the trench in a way, because he's so skilled with cloth. And so obviously he'll be skilled on the ground. So everywhere it felt like a sense of ownership, a sense of adventure as well, a sense of interpretation of what it was.
And I think also what's very important, and what also came across in Soumya's book, is actually a lot of the people employed in the excavation sites, many of them are women. In Kiladi, there were a whole bunch of these wonderfully brightly dressed, women. And you do see these continuities, like one of them was wearing some earring, which I thought looked exactly like, something that I'd seen at Kiladi, or, some of the other sites and things like that, some of the other early historic sites. And likewise, in Dholavira also, you'll see, the Rabari women with the shell bangles going right up to the, to the shoulders, which is very reminiscent of the dancing girl in a way. So the people, living there, and their enthusiasm was so wonderful. All these women were so excited, and apparently I was also told that they were actually the best workers, and most women being very meticulous with things and so on. So that, I think, this is also what I think. I'm very glad that Soumya has given a lot of space to a lot of us women researchers, not just myself, but also, for instance, Kavya, who was doing some of the DNA extraction at Kiladi, and the trouble taken, the arduousness of the process of archaeology. I think that is something which you would never get in a dry excavation report, any of our publications that we would do. That whole face of it is totally not seen. But I think this is what, for me, was really very a revelation, that Samya was able to bring out this everyday kind of arduousness, really, of the labor and so on, the physical work at extraction and things like that, and even with the scientific processes and so on. I think that journey, and also even, of course, discovering the sites and so on, which is serendipitous. But then some of them, like Manikam, was like, this is where we haven't come to Shivagalai and Arjunur, but so let's not go away from Kirti. And of course, what we should not forget about Kirti, and I think what Samya also brings about in her book is, that evocativeness of the milieu of Sangam poetry. I think that, she, of course, talks about the Madurai Kanchi and so on. And so that is also something which really kind of comes to mind there, the descriptions of the paved streets and, the textiles worn, and so many of the facets that we see in, a range of Sangam literature, that really comes to life when you're, kind of just wondering about them, I'm sure. And as she talked about the Marudam as well, the pastoral, aspect of Kirti, in the sense she talks about, it evokes to you the ideas of those past romances also, because of course Sangam poetry has this very rich tradition of the Agam love poetry, and then the bardic poetry. And of course, the significance of Madurai in the Sangam Tamil literature, because this was where, all the poets were assembling, and this bardic poetry was being written about all these various chieftains and so on. So all of that also got evoked. But I think here also, so that we were going to then transition to the Iron Age, right? But that's also very interesting that in the Sangam context, you do have the discussion of, this more urbanized milieu and the markets and, the pearls and so on. And then we know the mention of the Yavanas, who are the Ionians and the Greeks. Of course, Kirti is what we see at the end of the Iron Age. It's more early historic, going into that and so on. But there is, for instance, one of the verses in Sangam poetry very explicitly mentions the bard singing to, in this case, the Chola of that era chieftain, and talking about how, oh, build me an urn for my dead chieftain, and make it large enough so that I can also get in. This is the bard talking, because that was a kind of devotion. So already there you would have had this urn burial tradition. And I think where our conversations are also going is because also her book talks about it. It's very important to because what we're seeing with Kirti again was not just, an isolated, event. If we look at it in the totality of what was happening in Tamil Nadu. And I think, the urn burial, the findings on Shivagalai and Adichanallur, and some of the very early AMS dates that have been coming out, for earlier finds of copper, bronze, and iron, and so on, which again challenges our notion that that there was a later development in Tamil Nadu, because some of these dates, as we know, are now very early, but we'll transition to that later. But I was just pointing out that already in the Sangam literature also you get all of these facets sort of described, which is, I think, the exciting aspect of archaeology in Tamil Nadu, that you can find a parallel both in literature and archaeology, Maybe that's that you also see perhaps, I don't know, in the North, in the Gangetic context, maybe people have been trying to do that with the epics and so on. But but I think, as Dr. Rajan was pointing out, in the Sangam literature, of course, it's much more very everyday things which are talked about, for which you can actually make much more of a correlation with the archaeological findings, whereas, the epics or the other Vedic corpus and all that is much more of a ritualistic and so on nature, which is of a slightly different nature, I suppose. Yeah, that.
No, on the part of how people who are working there, it's absolutely amazing. People who are previously agricultural laborers, women, and it is, yes, I think about 70 to 80% women working there. And I was just asking the lead archaeologists there, how do they know when to come to you if they find something, if it's significant, if it's something, how do they go about it? They said, yes, we do give them a few days of training when they come in first, but by now, most of them have become experts by themselves. They can identify. They come to us and they say, I think this looks like this. But But I just want to quickly take a step back for those of them who are wondering, what is it that you do? What does
What am I doing here? Like,
archaeometallurgist
sort of
mean?
gate crashing on poor Soumya's
I mean, journalism is pretty straightforward. So I think
What does an archaeometallurgist do? What does that mean?
Right. So basically, it's a branch of archaeological sciences where we try and study metallic heritage, metallurgical heritage, and see what we can construe about the past, not just in terms of history of technology, but also sometimes in terms of provenance and, the classifications and style and so on. Of course, a lot of my work had been on the Chola bronzes and, the analysis of Chola bronzes and so on, and characterization, fingerprinting, and so on. But then I've also been involved since quite early on, also looking at the Iron Age in terms of. So I was one of the very early people also to examine some of the iron ferrous metal finds from Kodumanal, which is a habitation cum burial site, which has now got an AMS date of about 5th century BC. But also, I had written a book called India's Legendary Wood Steel, which, of course, the first edition was 2004, but then it had another edition and so on. And so, what I had really looked at there was this early tradition of making very good. Ferrous metal production and the making of high-grade steel, which was, and there were these accounts of 18th century and so on, European travelers, where they talked about steel being made by crucible processes in southern India and so on. But what we didn't know that actually had, an earlier archaeological record, where through the analysis, I was able to identify some examples of crucibles which were used for steel making and to analyze these remnants of high carbon steel. And in fact, the term for steel, which was woods, was a corrupted, European corruption of the term urukku or ukku. Ukku was a term which was used in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu and so on. But ukku also goes back ultimately to the Tamil word urukku, which actually refers to, molten metal. Because even today, even in Andal's verse, she sings about, when it comes to the bronzes, she says, "Ullai ulla melagu urukki vengalam utru," which means that you, let the wax flow out and the bronze get, molten bronze flow in. So this term for molten, so it was in a way some of the findings that I had made in Melsiruvalur, which was a site outside Tiruvannamalai, showing from the crucible remnants that this was actually crucible carburization in what was almost viscous or even molten state. It had to be done by firing wrought iron with high carbon remnants at very high temperatures. And so that term urukku also refers to that, not forged metal.
Changed that in the second
Okay,
edition.
yeah. But so that's where also the excitement of being an archaeologist, because I remember that this was in the 90s, and I wrote a little bit also in a more kind of travelogue kind of way. So I took an auto all the way from Tiruvannamalai across 100 kilometers, with this auto driver, and I said, where is this? Because some geologists had told me that, yeah, we thought, I don't know, maybe some slag, something or the other I found somewhere in Melsurur. So we're going from village to village. Which is Melsurur? Where is Melsurur? And then going there and ask them, they were saying, just finding old pots, did you find, the Parishi, did you find any manpanagal, this, that, and whatnot. So eventually we did find this canal. And first, when we were looking at it, because, as an archaeologist, when you're looking at debris, I was just wondering whether I'm looking at a lot of because there was these cows around, and am I just looking at a lot of, ossified cow dung or what is it? And I was looking down, and then I recognized that this is actually slags and crucibles, So then, of course, that's how I was able to identify what still is, I think, one of the very clear identifications of the use of ultra high carbon steel and using crucible carburization. So the point is actually, so we also did know by then that we were getting very early remnants of, early and sophisticated ferrous metal production at that time. Yeah.
Before I look at the larger narrative, some of the tools and the weapons that we see in Kildi that's kept in the museum, which is a very beautiful museum adjacent to the excavation site. What does that tell us about what kind of people possibly lived? I know that you said it's hard to say for sure this or that, but what kind of insights does that give us?
Well, one thing that really struck struck me, of course, about Kiriti. Now we're talking about the second urbanization, and I think that's probably true, wherever in the country, that you don't see any marked evidence of what kind of what exactly were their rituals or whatever. All of that I think just remains speculation. But you do see a lot of these. I think they were quite playful because there's a lot of gamesmen, finds hopscotch and then dice. I mean, whoever they were obviously enjoying. They did have a sense of play, not maybe a very kind of it was not only that you could in a very pointedly way find evidence of, I don't know, I mean, at least like not like when I went to China, for example, you actually find in Anyang, you see these kind of cauldrons with heads in it. So they were up to some really funny rituals. So we don't see any evidence of some markedly bizarre things, but they just seem to be kind of quite normal in a way and just enjoying life, which is a nice thing. And of course, in
Probably an
Kiriti,
ancient museum or something. How do
That
we know
got
what
dark
it was?
very quickly. I didn't see that coming. Please go on.
yeah and so yeah, in that sense I think that also in a way makes Kiriti kind of interesting. And I suppose that's also where one tends to, when you look at the Harappan also, you say there's no market evidence that they were doing any particular, they were following any particular, I mean like we could see clearly with the Egyptians that they believed in mummification in the afterlife. Of course, the difference is the Harappan script has not been deciphered, so we don't know exactly what language, whichever way it is. It's all speculation, and remains that way. So, but at least with the Egyptians, we know that they believed in the afterlife. So we don't actually know anything, and there's nothing markedly, let's say, in the Harappan. But I would say that generally in the second urbanization, even in other parts of India, there's no real evidence of anything. It's only when you come to the early historic period that you start getting, maybe images and into the Gupta and the Puranic period. That so all of those ideas of symbols and so on, all that discussion, I think, is a bit out of context with some of these early historic sites. But you do know, but I mean, the cutoff is when you start seeing, at Kodumanal and even at Kiriti, at the later phases, you start seeing the evidence of Roman, finds and Roman, which again, then in Pattanam, the Indo-Roman site of Pattanam or Muziris, which you also touch upon in your book, then you very markedly see, things like the Sphinx in the intaglio, so evidence of Roman trade and so on. And obviously there was, but what is interesting is earlier when we were looking at, I mean, we know that there are a lot of these Roman coin hoards and all that in South India, but we didn't know who was actually, what was the nature of the people who were there. So to that extent, we know that there was already some urbanized milieu there, for instance, in Kiriti and all that, with whom then they were coming in and trading and so on. So it wasn't like they were just only dealing with, the megalithic people, which they may have also been doing. But there's clearly also, and that's also what the Sangam poetry then ratifies, because they do talk about the Yavanas and so on. So that's
I think one of the reasons why Kiriti has got so much attention and captured imagination is that it's because it challenges this who we were as a people in the subcontinent, this North-centric narrative. Tell us how this fits into that and how this has become about identity for not just Tamil, but also for the South Indian population. Many of us in other states also, feel a sense of pride. But tell how that comes.
But just to add, sorry, because you asked about iron in Kiriti, if you go further south, and I mean, in fact, if you come to Chennai and you go to the Egmore Museum, in the anthropology wing is the wonderful collection of Adichanallur artifacts. And once you start digging up, when you asked about what were the sense, who were these people, right? What is the sense we get? There's a lot of course, conjecture left behind by the way that archaeologists have interpreted those. But there seems to be, and in the description, you'll see that there's something called cult of the dead. And that I found very interesting, that the way these iron implements were also sort of buried into the ground around these urns was an indication that perhaps they were using this in an afterlife. And that was really fascinating to me. And I have to say, because we talked about skulls in a jar, in an urn, when I started this, I too was freaked out about dead people and burials. And today I feel like I jump towards any kind of like skeleton or skull. So the burial archaeology enthusiast that I have now become, I went to Jordan last year and I took hundreds of photos of skulls. So to me, I feel like my brain has now switched to dead people, which I find very interesting. As
Scary.
as for what did we understand of South India, I think I can only speak from experience. I went to a CBSE school, like many people here, perhaps, and the mention of South India, like you mentioned, was Cholas, right? The first thing I can remember is Cholas, the greatness of the Chola kings. But otherwise, I feel like I learned more about the Mauryans, the Guptas. I learned a hell of a lot about the British. Like I was not even interested in the British, but I feel like I know so much about them, and not so much about Mughals. Was once here and there, but colonial history is what we seem to be focusing on a lot more. At least when I was growing up and I went to school. But the thing with Keeladi, I think, is it opened up this idea that what we thought this region didn't have, there's evidence of it. There is an argument to be made that people may not have built with bricks because it's hot. Like, why would you live in a fully built up place when it's so hot and humid? And today, that is the reality. We all live in concrete houses. But I remember through these conversations, many people telling me, and Professor Rajan makes this point. He's Tamil Nadu's leading archaeologist. He says, even Rajendra Chola left behind this wonderful temple, but we're still looking for his palace. There is a remnant of the palace, that it being a stone base, but perhaps the rest of it was timber, rest of it was cloth, right? So why are we thinking of that as a sign of urbanization? It could be that people were still living in these places, they were literate, and there were urban markers that are different to how you and I understand it from textbooks. So to me, this particular site sort of suddenly opened up this idea that perhaps South India had all of these things going on independently of the other parts of the country. And unfortunately today, because we are locked into this North versus South debate, it is framed as independently of North India. But back then, everything was connected. There were so many more cultural exchanges. Wherever I went, and especially all of the senior archaeologists in Tamil Nadu will make this point, all of them were talking to each other. The Romans came, the Arabs came, coins were found, There's so much wonderful cultural exchanges that unfortunately, when we are seeing it from today and our point of view today, we want to make a point that we were distinctly different. We want to make the point that we had all of this much before you did. So it becomes a first mover sort of argument rather than are we even able to understand what history is and our collective past. And to me, that was why I started with Keeladi, but it started getting more and more expansive. And it felt like this cannot end with Keeladi. Like the first version of this book was, I'm going to write each chapter on one artifact from Keeladi. And I spoke to Samant Subramaniam, who's a good friend and a fantastic nonfiction writer, and he's like, nobody's going to read that. Don't bother. And I was like, but like, it's so fascinating. And he's like, think more. And so the more I thought about it, it felt like this isn't an isolated story. This is a story that is complicated. All of us are hugely mixed. I don't think we realize how mixed we are if we all do a DNA test. We come from all kinds of places. So there's nothing pure about who we are. So why do we get so caught up with this idea of that we are so distinct from someone? And I think Keeladi is a good step to at least question, are these definitions something we need to relook at? Are these conversations something we need to have? So I feel like that is how it sort of finds a place, and it has found such an important place as a symbol of, like a cultural symbol in a sense in Tamil Nadu.
Since
And I
you,
think I'll add one thing, of course, which is that in one sense, of course, I think that there is something maybe in that thinking that one thing is there that you do find a lot of graffiti marks in Tamil Nadu, much more so than and like Dr. Rajan has also pointed out that the just the number of graffiti marks found even in Keeladi. And now, of course, they also call it the Tamil Brahmi and so on. And so on those findings of the potsherds, you find a lot more of that in Tamil Nadu than you do elsewhere. So I think that has also kind of maybe, added to this whole heightened thing of the connection with language and, the idea of, Sangam literature and, the written and so on. So which is maybe a dimension which you see quite a lot more in the context of Tamil Nadu. But I think you can understand where that is also, it has its own let's say basis, that viewpoint and so on, which maybe gives it something a bit distinctive as well. The fact that you can identify so many names, Artan and so on, right at Keeladi and so on the potsherds and so on. So that adds a certain, and the fact now that we have the AMS dating. One thing I should make clear here when I'm talking about the AMS dating, well, you were going to ask me about that, but anyway. We should, earlier when a lot of the dating was being done in India, it was using standard radiometric dating, and it was done in Indian labs and so on. And so, for a long time, that was a practice. So maybe people were like, okay, whatever, at least when it came to the international setup, we don't know how reliable and so on. But the Tamil Nadu government, very, very, in a very dedicated and conscious way, they've been going after getting AMS dates only by the top lab. Like they pay for it and they get it done, like with this beta analytics and this and that. And that's why when these dates have been coming out, you can't just say, oh, but, like, for instance, this potsherd, which had from Porunthal or whatever, which is, again, got what we call a Tamil Brahmi inscription, which has been dated to 7th century, which apparently could be seen as one of the earliest, of that kind of, which then again, that, discussion of how it is versus the Ashokan and so on. So the fact that they have been using, the top AMS labs, and that is where, in a way, the very early dates that they got for Shivagalai, the iron dates, which, of course, I don't know about, 3,000 plus and everything, but certainly if you look at, there are certain, at least 4 dates which are before 2,500 BC of that range. And whether you can at least say that there is something going on there which is coeval with, the Harappan period. And of course, as I said, with the finds that you get, like there were some which were done on millets and so on. Okay, so 1,300, because when you date millets, in a way, that's much more secure, because with the AMS, it's a process where it gets, people don't question millet dates. But when it comes to charcoal, maybe there is some cause, but there are enough of them, it's not just, and then also Mailadam several other, and also the other thing was, there was also the case of a high carbon blade, which has been dated, from Telanganur, which had an AMS date on the steel itself. That's a direct dating of the steel, which has been done by the top labs in Arizona, which was, 1600 BC. So if they had that already by that time, if they had high carbon steel already, so there has to have been some backstory for the early dates. So I think that is where, I think that puts everything into, a different perspective in the whole dimensions of, yeah.
I just wanted to understand this. When I was there, a lot of people were talking about how this was a sophisticated urban settlement, right? It's something that people are saying more loosely now because, like we spoke about, people take a lot of pride in it. What are the markers of some excavation being a sophisticated urban settlement? Water systems, what are the different markers?
One thing, of course, is that when you're using bricks already, that is, for bricks for foundations, then you've gone to another step of building. It's not just thatch and so on. And the size of the bricks, of course, bricks were also found in Arikamedu by Wheeler. So that was also a kind of not an isolated finding, because Arikamedu also you have Puhar also and so on. That itself. And then, the use of the ring wells, that of course is something which shows that they had some, sense of drainage and all of those aspects. And yes, there is some, because at Dholavira, you see extensive reservoirs and things like that. But there is some attempt here.
There is a channel that goes from the ring well.
It's much smaller and quainter. It's like a little mini model. Yeah, it's just cuter because, of course, Dholavira, so the Ran, of course, it's very magical in its own way. But this is very cute. It's a kind of, what I like about Kiradi, it's a kind of child's archaeological site. And if you have children, please take them, because it's absolutely delightful for a child, because it's just like, somebody would build a little kind of house for a child.
But you spoke about your newfound fascination with burial grounds. If I could ask another question on that, I was told when I was there that they have the burial grounds that they found. We saw that in the museum as well. Sorry, what did you make out of how they treated burial, and how is it being taken out? Because it can't be exposed to sunlight, so they do it, once it's dark, and then all night long they work, and in the morning they kind of try to categorize what's what. So tell us how that process is working.
So I saw the first, I saw Kavya, who's a young archaeological officer, work at the Kondagai site. That was the first time I saw someone in what we all know as COVID getup, right? A PPE suit. And poor thing, it was like insanely hot. And she had a tarpaulin above her, like strung up so that you can keep the urn in the shadow, and fully sort of made up and doing this kind of really superb and systematic way of excavating. So the thing with archaeology, and it makes it more complicated when it's a skeleton in there, is that you can't have anything contaminate the sample, especially as a modern human. So it's very easy to contaminate. But every part of it is wonderfully documented. So there has to be photos taken of every layer. So I write in the book that she's literally like half her body is in trying to excavate it. And this is something that goes on for many hours. So once you start, you can't stop. And so there is a photograph of Kavya on the site with actually a flashlight, because at night she continues the work. So there are times when you, of course, you might have started in the evening and it goes on to late in the night, but very much that sunlight is a big problem. And they have been finding ways to think about perhaps should we, pull the whole urn out and take it to a lab where we then take it out, or what is the best way to do it. So from what I understand, a lot of it is also done at night, which makes it way more challenging. But they've managed to, bring out some skeletons and send it for ancient DNA testing. So, and that work is continuing. I think there is a tie-up between the Madurai Kamaraj University and the Harvard Medical School, where you have an ancient DNA lab run by David Reich, who's one of the most, leading sort of geneticists. So he, I think there's now awaiting results to see if we can find anything about who once lived in this part.
There were a bunch of school children who'd come there on their picnic, and they were very intrigued to know that there were two sizes of the burial pots, one for single and one where you could get buried together as a couple. And much like the Egyptians, you could also put in certain things that they thought you could use in afterlife. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are references to this in the Sangam poetry as well, the different kinds of burials. And one of it is, they've told me this, it's called Mudumakkaltari, where a very old infirm person is lowered into the pot, and I think till their end of their life. So you leave a lot of rice and other things that will, or even I think, I would imagine some form of fire, but that is probably me just conjecturing. But they have found rice samples in there, so the arisi basically, and water, and even they've in different parts of Tamil Nadu, because this particular lab, Madurai Kamaraj University, gets a lot of biological samples from other parts of Tamil Nadu, and they've even found cholesterol, which is a sign of like meat, and so few other offerings that are made, which is likely food. So many of this has references in the Sangam literature. So there is references to twin pot burial. There's references to two skeletons in a pot, or single, or even surface burials. So in one reference I found, they even leave the body out, like I guess the Parsis do, for it to be picked on by birds and other animals. And then whatever's remaining, the bones are then put into a pot. So it's like a secondary burial. So if you go to the Adichanallur site, there is actually a skeleton in a glass box, and there's a curious case where only the top part of the hand is missing, the bone here. So again, it was a very interesting case of wonder what happened, right? Was it just lost by chance, or was there a specific ritual? So I remember the archaeologist who showed me around joking, saying, these megalithic people, just every day they throw like a curveball at us, and we're trying to figure out who they are, and every day they show something new, and we're still not able to fully come to a conclusion. But I think the poems are a good baseline to try and understand what people had written about burials back in the day.
Well, since we came to Adichanallur, which I think have some important things to say there, well, I'm really quite squeamish, compared to Samya for the burials. But of course, Adichanallur and Shivagalai are where we're getting these very early iron dates. And talking of the burials, what I think is very interesting is, as I said, you're seeing this quite sophisticated early bronze repertoire, because I had analyzed some of these vessels from Adichanallur, both from Riya's collections and then also from the excavated context now. And those are actually what we call heightened beta bronzes. It's a particular kind of bronze of a composition of 23% tin. And I also found a parallel, surviving tradition where they were hot forging at this high temperature of, about 600 to 700 degrees centigrade, where this intermetallic beta phase formed, and then quenching it so that retention gives certain properties. And these seem to be the earliest examples of heightened beta bronzes that can, that are known now, because the date is about 1200 or 1300 BC. So there is where in the article that Soumya refers to, what I've tried to say is that if we are to take these, very earlier dates of iron, which you said go back to about 2500 BC, and the fact that you do find in Adichanallur, both from Riya's collections and also from the current excavations, this evidence of, for instance, these little tiny metal figurines, which in a way do recall to some of the Harappan prototypes, like the dog figurine and also, the antelope and some other things, which I can't, and of course, Rhea had already found the mother goddess, which is a very, a tiny little artifact, but it has some characteristics which really, are very similar to Harappan mother goddess statues, the Orianum or the belt and, the hairstyle and so on. So what I had conjectured is that, was there already some maritime connection by which, because, you can't just develop iron smelting like that out of the blue. So whether there had already been some copper smelters from the northwest in the Harappan region who had come down by the sea route, and that's why they come to Adichanallur, and then they may, because it's not very copper rich compared to, let's say, the northwest and so on. It's much more iron rich. And so just adventitiously have they come upon, and also this heightened bronze tradition, I think, comes from the tradition of using binary bronzes, which goes back also to the Harappan context, though they don't use quite such heightened bronzes. So there was obviously some skilled metallurgists who had come there at some point, and whether they had experimented with iron ores and then also, discovered iron smelting, which could be one way to explain these early dates, because these are all still the conundrums that people are working through, and we have a lot on our plate to unpack there.
The mother goddess part ties to what I was going to ask you. I didn't want to touch too much upon the controversy surrounding Kiri, but one thing that has become a bone of contention is the fact that one section believes that there were no markers of ritualistic practices, which then they made a leap into saying that this was disconnected from the Vedic practices. How do you see that? Is that too much of a leap? Do you think what we know so far points to that?
I definitely wouldn't make a strong statement on it, only because I'm not trained as an archaeologist. But this is an argument that is often put forward as to why Keeladee is distinctive, and it is distinct to the northern riverine plains, where is seen as the sort of birthplace of the Vedic civilization. Having said that, like we were discussing before, what is that definition of a Vedic civilization and what does it look like? But in Keeladee, for instance, even though those definitions are said to not be there, when I did my research, there were people who said, okay, fair enough, it might be distinct from the north, but you can't also say it's devoid of religion. It may not be religion in the way that the Vedic, sort of the Vedic culture, but the names on these potsherds could be, say, Jain names or Buddhist names. So those, there is a contention on that. Some people believe that these could, relate to Buddhist names. And when I asked an epigraphist about it, he said, absolutely not. These are all Tamil names and they come from the Sangam world. So I think what is interesting again is how far back do we go, right? And where do we draw the line on what we think is acceptable to say about something? And we often forget that there were people who lived in these parts for years before and who were there and, what did they pray to? So it is difficult to say for sure, but this is a debate that is happening within the archaeology. I don't know if we will find an answer to it, but there definitely was two sides to, was there religion in Keeladee? And like you pointed out, these figurines is something you'll find even if you go to the National Museum in Delhi. Incredible sort of collection of figurines in the Harappan Gallery. The most wonderful, I refer to it, one particular figurine looks like a person just has a headache and wants to be left alone. That was my interpretation anyway. But she looked so irritated with the world, right? So it also was, what are these? And I remember walking around with a public historian in Delhi, and he said, was this a children's civilization then? Were these made for kids to play? Again, there's so much we don't know. And so the only research will let us come to some form of conclusion. But this particular point is something that is very firmly spoken about as a distinction to the north.
And of course, speaking of the so-called mother goddess, it's basically a female representation. And I should say that that is actually part of Neolithic cultures. Neolithic Europe had that all over. You had, and again, they're also labeled as mother goddess or whatever, or the Venus or whatever, we don't know. And that's also what you find in Harappa. And if you're finding it there, this was also found, in earlier cultures. We don't have to actually attribute or not, some ideas to it.
My name is Vinayak Hegde and I'm a techie, but I'm interested in history. And I came across this Twitter post, which I kind of can't believe because lots of posts on Twitter are honestly, pardon my French, equivalent to WhatsApp University. But there was this interesting claim by this lady. She wrote that India was manufacturing wood steel, which was invented, I think, 2,300 years ago. And it has parallels with what you said, which is high carbon steel.
I
And
spoke about exactly that, the same thing.
yeah, and also that it was used, and Damascus steel or Damascus steel swords
Yes.
were being made in India way before Damascus, and hence we were kind of for lack of a better word, the inventors of Damascus steel. So I just want to know whether that is true or is it debated still?
Yeah, so that is what I think I've also found, and is also generally, I also talked about the Telanganur sword, which had an AMS date. I don't know if you heard what I said. That had an AMS date of 1600 BC. So that was clearly an ultra high carbon steel. Ultra high carbon steel is this wood steel. So it seems to have been already prevalent, quite early on. I think that is what I was also trying to say, exactly that. And later on, of course, it's the medieval period that it starts, the Damascus blades, the export and so on comes at, those of the Arab accounts and so on. It was being traded. And probably I've also pointed out, because I also found an ultra high carbon steel, which is basically what Boots is. It is an ultra high carbon steel of about 1.2% carbon. And I also found a nail from Pattanam, which is Indo-Roman site with a date of about 1st century. And why that's significant is because you also get these accounts from the Roman world of iron from the Ceres. So the Ceres could have referred to the Chera kingdom. So these could have been exported from there out to the Mediterranean and so on. Yeah.
My question is regarding not regarding, but about the controversy about the North versus South and all the political games that are being played. If we were able to keep that aside, and from a journalistic point of view, what are the myths, or not myths, but the established beliefs, historical beliefs that have been clearly exploded by what's happened at Kiladi, and what stuff is still up for debate in terms of, or still being debated from a journalistic point? No, I'm not looking from a historian.
There's no other option for me. Journalism
Yeah,
only I
that's
can
why
speak for.
not what the historians are saying,
Sure.
but what you read, what you saw.
I think the idea that the second urbanization only happened in the Gangetic Plains and then everything came to us after, that is something that was clear from what I've understood, that perhaps we just didn't find a site before this, and this gave a good understanding of how did the same time period look in the southern region. So that is one thing that I feel like, just from roaming around and speaking to people, I feel strongly about that it makes sense. And also that corresponding to the Sangam literature, there are references. It is debatable how you date the Sangam literature, but it's broadly 300 BC to 300 CE. So many of these, I write about it as Kiladi became a Sangam laboratory, right? So you did see a connection between the artifact and the poem. And if you go to the museum today, you'll see in every next to every artifact, there's a little column that says this particular poem says this, this, this. And what was the second part of that question? Is that it? Very debatable.
I went to the museum, and of course there's a lot of propaganda. Or the point of view of, say, the Tamil culture being superior or whatever, which is fine. I think there's space for that compared to saying that, Indus Valley.
I would say that Kiladi is one example of a larger situation in South India. It is propped up as the biggest story. But in just the last 5 years, that story has moved further to southern Tamil Nadu, where we found iron and so on. So to me, what is unanswered is many of these are told to us as results, but is there a stronger backstory that stitches it together? And yeah, I think that would be it, that there is more to be said, and there is a layer of politics that I would recommend that you set aside while you understand this. And that was the point of this book, that I'll tell you the politics, but I'll also try and explain to you that there's more to it.
And I think also the way that connection is, because Kiridi, you also have Kondagai, which has the urn burials right there. So the connection with that earlier, megalithic Iron Age urn burial kind of civilization, or whatever you call it, culture, and with the early historic. And perhaps, yeah, if more early historic sites are excavated in other parts of India, I mean, you do have Shishupalgarh and so on. But I think also Kiridi, maybe the proximity to Madurai, which is like a proper city and all that. The others are all kind of very remote and so on. So there's nothing really very exciting to go to or to see. I mean, in the process of getting there. But Madurai is it's a great city in its own way. It's got its own culture, and it's got those temples and of course museums. So
Meenakshi
people want
Amman
to
and
actually
mutton,
go
both are
there.
very good.
So that aspect, of course, also adds to it.
But the only silver lining in all the propaganda is because of that, there's a lot of time, money, and resources being given to that. There's something happening in Karnataka, in Maski. It's not given that kind of attention or resources. So there is a flip side to that. Absolutely.
And there's one more come up, Purunai Museum, which I haven't seen yet, but we should all go.
Next
visit.
book, perhaps.
Yes, but and the time that I'd been there, they'd also put the glass so you could actually see the urns underneath and so on, which was also quite exciting. Yeah. So.
Hi, my name is Krishna. I am in hospitality and I'm in food. So in the face of all this erudition, my question might feel frivolous and trivial, but I'm curious about what those people ate. And I'm also curious about how, in terms of stature, physical stature, how different were they from us because of their diet?
I don't think even the archaeologists know this, so I definitely don't. What they ate, rice, millets, vegetables, all of this is from biological studies. Goat, they ate a lot of goat. There were cut marks on some of the bones that were excavated from Kiladi. I don't know, do you remember any
Pork,
more?
I was told.
Yeah, pork. Is it? Yeah, pork. But there's a whole, and millets. I feel like they had different versions of millets that they grew, and there are references to that in the poems as well. So these are from a cross section of across Tamil Nadu, not just Kiladi. But in Kiladi, I know for sure there were a mix of animals, millets, rice, is what I remember reading. No idea. Clearly, I mean, I know that 40 was considered like senior citizen. So when I heard this story, I had already become a senior citizen. And they're examining the bones. So there's Dr. Veena Mushrif from Tripathi from Deccan College. She's looking through bone samples from Kiladi and from Kondagai. And she has found some interesting sort of aspects of, deformities in the body. And also she's the one who said that in antiquity, 30 itself is very old. So people didn't live that long, obviously. So
They have released some images of the facial reconstruction. So I don't know how accurate that is. But
stature is still not
of course,
is debatable, but yeah, there is a face to who could have lived there.
In the megalithic Tamil Nadu, they might is it possible they might not have followed a religion which has like Buddhism, Hinduism, or Jainism, because in Norse mythology, in bronze. No, Scandinavia followed like a solar god, but then after when you come to Iron Age, you have Thor and all these different gods. But so it's possible they might not have a connection.
But the fact that you're finding all these, these miniature versions of these urn burials, because then you find that in Adichnur also, in Ria's collection, you have miniatures of the urn burials as well, with animal figurines on top, like the goats and, the peacock and so on. And that is where actually, I'm just theorizing, but there is, I think, some connection with either late Harappan or somewhere, because there too you get peacocks on some funerary, pottery and things like that. But so you do find, so what are those animals doing where they had their funerary connection? But I think that may also take me in a completely different interpretation of what we're seeing also in the Harappan context, and also something which I'm still kind of thinking about and so on. But
My name is Aditya, and I have a question about this Brahmi script. Like, you mentioned Brahmi, and which modern Indian scripts used to write the languages today are descended from Brahmi?
I can speak more about Tamil Brahmi, but I don't know about the parent Brahmi. But how it came into Tamil Nadu, there are two theories. One is the Jains brought it in, and the Brahmi script. And then it was, if you go to the hills around Madurai, many of the caves have inscriptions on them written in Tamil Brahmi, which is an early iterant of the Tamil script. However, that is challenged by the collection of huge number of graffiti marks from various archaeological sites in Tamil Nadu, where there is a theory that perhaps writing came from these graffiti marks, and that is given the nomenclature Tamili. So there are two separate versions of how the script came about in the region. Again, it depends on how one looks at it and what the perspective is. Yes.
yeah, and there's also a tendency now to actually not call it Tamil Brahmi, but Tamilese, to point out that it has its own maybe root.
yeah.
It's all still in the.
Right at the
Uh,
back.
Hi, this is Minnie Menon. And Dr. Srinivasan, you've written for us on my platform, Live History India, which is something that we had created. So it's lovely to see you in person. I have a question. You see, it's very interesting and nice to see, people like Soumya writing about history, because a lot of this has been lost in PhD theses and archaeology reports, etc. It's all coming out. Of course, I've always wondered why Kiradi was such a big surprise, because, Vaigai has a whole lot of Mesolithic sites all along the course of the river. We know of the Bay of Bengal trade network starting from about 1200 BCE, where a lot of the area was well connected, so to say, with trade networks, etc. What I'm finding interesting and a little disturbing is the reference to a lot of these sites as civilizations and not cultures. And I think that has to be called out, because that has an underlying political aspect to it. Because the fact is that Indian history has not been unidimensional. Even during the Harappan period, there were almost 21 other cultures. The Sothi, the Inamgaon, there's so many of these cultures that coexisted with the Harappan culture. And Kiladi could well have been, because, the South was so well connected with Egypt, with Mesopotamia, even in 1400, in Ramesses's sarcophagus, they found pepper, which came from Kerala. So, I mean, it is a very well documented and connected space. Today, to call it a civilization that has been unearthed, a civilization that was, parallel to the north, it's a little misleading, isn't it? And we are all falling under the trap of calling it a civilization. It is a culture. And many cultures coexisted. And that's how urbanization happened. That's how, the great cities of the South emerged in the early Chola period. And, so what is your interpretation of it? Are we all going with the flow of it and calling it a civilization? Or do you think we need to step back and say, hey, let's look at a larger picture?
Yeah, that's, thank you, Minnie. That's, of course, very important point here as to where and how this term civilization has sort of come into, the usage. I agree that there is this aspect of cultures, but I suppose, and I guess there is a bit of all of that, this conflation. But maybe in this context, because we've talked about civilizations, with Harappan or Mesopotamia, or Egypt, or even China, I mean, maybe the use of the writing is also something which, in that context has been there. And maybe the tendency in terms of Kiradi, maybe because of the fact that it's a fact that there is a very long, classical language which has survived in Tamil Nadu, which some say it's at least in its original form, like you can, I think there are very few languages where you can go back to, something which is dated to about, say, 3rd century BC and still find continuities in the way it's spoken. So the linguistic dimension, I suppose, and through that, the fact that allows you to, interpret various aspects and all that. So maybe the language dimension, perhaps, I mean, I won't say that justifies it, but that maybe gives it a certain other kind of nuance with some of the other, which maybe does separate it from, let's say, the megalithic, where we don't find such an obvious, and of course, yeah, in the north, you could say Prakrit and all that, but it's slightly, I think, maybe not. Yeah, of course, when you come to the Mahajanapadas, maybe it is being used to some extent, but then you do call it, in the Gangetic context, maybe also again it crops up. So, I mean, I must say, I refer to, the terms. I'm happy for the historians to quibble about, and I'm just looking at the metallographic aspects. But yes, in that sense, you could say cultures, but we do have to distinguish that whether the fact that there's a literate context does give it something which is more along the lines of what we call a civilization. And when you think about this Tamil Sangam poetry, there's something so contemporary about it. I mean, the fact that they're not just all only talking about, talking about love and lovers and, things which we may think it is, but it's for such a long time in between, people were just evoking gods and evoking this and that. But the fact that you can, talk about everyday things, just human emotions, I think it is a bit like, I think there is some comparison there with Greek, with maybe Greek, I don't know which other culture was doing it in that quite when they're writing theater and so on. So I think maybe it is a little bit of an exaggeration, but I don't think it's totally unfair either. I think it's okay. We can enjoy it that way too. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Your point taken, and I think we should look at that more in a historical context and make sure that doesn't keep happening. Absolutely.
If I can just add to it, I think social media plays a big role in our interpretation, and especially when you're outside Tamil Nadu, you do get a version of it from what you see on the internet. For instance, when the Shivagalai site revealed the oldest Iron Age sample, I remember my WhatsApp buzzed with a text that said ancient Tamils were smelting iron like 5,000 years ago, right? So it is an interpretation that also comes from a moment of pride of what has been found. And if you notice again, over the course of the last many years, the Tamil Nadu government, and credit due to them, they don't actually refer to Keeladi as a civilization. They just refer to Keeladi as an early historic site. And it is not the case in the museum either. It's not seen. It's not, the word civilization doesn't come up.
Yes, I think settlement would.
Yeah,
And
I know
popular
that someone
civilization has run with it.
Yeah,
and
for
made
sure.
it
And I know someone said that they saw propaganda at the museum, but the words either Tamil civilization or Dravidian civilization or Keeladi as a civilization, those are words that I have seen as interpretations that people have made online. So it is a social media sort of creation as well.
Yeah,
So not to be taken seriously. Yeah.
I am Kesavan from Chennai, Tamil Nadu. Also, I am a retired space scientist. So I have two technical questions. The samples, iron samples which you got, is there any heat treatment process were found, different kinds of heat treatments? Second question is the forgings, is that different kinds of forgings? What are all the process they have? Any research on that?
Yeah, you're talking about the iron samples? Or,
Iron samples, iron
yeah.
samples.
So as I said, with the bronzes, there's clear thermomechanical treatment, which was there at least from 1300 BC for these heightened bronzes. And the steel, yes, the Telanganur sword, you do find that there is evidence of spheroidization, where, so basically when you forge the high carbon steel, if it is about, say, 1.2% carbon steel, so there is this, it forms a structure which is pearlite and cementite, and then there is a spheroidization of the cementite. So one of the structures actually showed spheroidization. So there is some thermomechanical treatment as well of the ingot into the blade and so on. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Heike Wolter. I'm a historian from Germany, but in contemporary history. I have two questions for you. First one is on the title of your book. I wanted to know how you came upon the title of the book. Is it a clear reference to Saturn Who, or is it by chance, or how did you come about it? A second question would be, and maybe you have already answered a bit on this, is in Germany, there is a term called history culture. So meaning that what the narration about the past tells us at least as much about the past as about us. So what is it that we tell us about what does it say about ourselves? What does it say about you, what you found out?
Great questions, thank you. The Dig was actually the title of the long form piece I wrote in 2021. It was a great title for a piece. And then when it came down about 6 months ago, when we sat down to think about the title, I swear it was a 4-hour-long discussion. We got nowhere. And we even had a Google document going for 3 days where I kept adding nonsense titles and kept getting rejected.
What are some of them? I want to know.
I don't know. I think at some point I was at Journey Along the Vaigai, or like urns, pots, and metals, some like random 3-letter. In fact, I tried metals, myths, and something else to do the M, because that was selling these days with books.
Alliteration.
Yeah. And all the other historians were doing well with it, like Anirudh Kanisetti and Manu Pillai, so I was trying to copy them. And then I think finally I was like, please, we just need to get this book out. Can we just go with The Dig? And because it's a foreign reference, the movie was abroad and the novel that it was based on was also abroad, we felt like this would be distinctly an Indian The Dig. And also the subtitle sort of gives away what it really is about. So we felt it was important to clarify what the book is about, because it is a journalistic look at the politics of the past. So while I talk about one side, I'm also talking about like a larger context. The second question as to what it says about me. This is a really interesting story, and I sort of end with this in the epilogue, and I urge you to read it if possible. But I think my definition of who I am, or my origin story, was limited to my grandparents' home. I grew up in a neighborhood called Besant Nagar. My grandfather was a civil engineer, and we lived in a small 2-bedroom flat. It was me, my sister, and my grandparents. And it was a ground floor flat, and everything about it was perfect. We had a broken sort of washing machine, a lovely transistor that would wake up at 5 a.m. and scream like music. And at the back was the sort of water sump where my friends and I would sit and like gossip, and a teak tree. This was it. This was my origin story till I'm 40 years old. So till like 37, this was it. My home was this. I started working on this book and everything changed. I realized there's a much larger story to where we all came from. And to me, this quest was to figure that out for myself as much as it was to explain this larger collective sort of past that we are all sort of so fond of and we glorify so easily. So to me, this glorification was something that I have seen over and over, whether it comes to a religiously linked backstory, whether it comes to a early metal backstory, whether it comes to an urbanization backstory. But everywhere I went, and even, for instance, like I would love to have gone to Mohenjo-daro, but I can't as an Indian. It would be very difficult to cross the border to see the Harappan sites. So I go on a virtual tour through a tour operator. I make him walk me around the site through his phone. And to me, that was like, oh, wow, like we came from here, because our versions of the first urbanists was the Harappan. So it was a very thrilling experience. So as I dug, it was more about this question of, can I explain this to myself? And in the process, can I explain it to you? And that's why there is a lightness to it, because I use humor in a way to make sort of light of things. That's just how I am as a person. And so it also allows me this access into, your space and time for you to like come with me to, get these questions answered. And there are many parts in this book where I have an answered story. It isn't a complete story. Kiladi is not a finished story. Like it's a mini excavation site, as they mentioned. It's 110 acres and only like 10% is dug up. So we really don't know how big this site is. And it's a complicated story because it involves land and people who really live there today, and convincing them to move out to dig something is a hard task. So to me, in this process, apart from Besant Nagar, I think my origin story included Madurai. Somehow I felt really excited about going there. I fell in love with the people and the food. And so today I go back, and from an Ilayaraja song, it's a Santosh Narayan song that plays in my mind where I'm like, oh my God, this is home. So the idea that I could have multiple homes or multiple origins was really thrilling to me. Thank you.
Well, Soumya, if you don't know what to do next, I'd be very happy to offer you a research position if I had the funding. And here I should come back to, in a way, I'd like to say, since Minnie also raised this question and Soumya mentioned about social media, I actually feel it was a lot easier to be a researcher in archaeology like 3 decades ago, when we were just like, talking to researchers and just publishing in our journals and everything. And, we're like
I'm
free of.
nudging her to write part 2 of this book, so don't take her away just yet.
Writing about elephants next.
But now what has happened is actually in a way become there's, and everything is now instant with social media and this that. So in a way I feel that we do need to give the time for researchers to, in fact there's a time when I used to get exasperated with all these this popular history writing, because what happens to people like us who are struggling to publish, because even before we get the story out, they've got it out. And so before I've put my stuff out, I've like given all my ideas away in talks, simply because that's what I don't even have the time to like write up my papers. But we need to do that, because if you want this work to actually, like, even, let's face it, okay, as many press articles and as many like press conferences and whatever that are done, we need to get, my Height and Bronze work is taken seriously only because it came out in the top peer reviewed journals. And so with the Chola, this thing and all that. So we really need to nurture, the scholarship of it as well, and give, also. But one good thing, of course, is all of this interest, I hope, leads to more funding and support, which is another very, very, very difficult situation, which I think in a way, and that's what I really, really enjoyed so much about Soumya's book, that she brought out all of these dilemmas, the people working, their challenges, and, it's all a very, I think, complex and engaging thing. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to share a platform with, and she was going to go on to do, part 2 and whatever others. So all the best, Soumya. And it was wonderful also in conversation with you, Pooja. Thank you.
I had a archaeometallurgy question, which is pretty basic. Which, can you hear me? Which was, my name is Sai Sudha. I write on history for children, so not popular history. And I wanted to ask, normally when we're talking about technology and ages, we talk about Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. And I always thought of it as we're improving on our advancing technologically, and bronze before iron, because I thought it was related to smelting temperatures. Am I right?
Yes, that's
So,
right.
firstly, how did they achieve these high temperatures, do you think, for the steel and, those? Do we know that?
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely. The progression of the use of materials, from the Stone Age, and then the copper bronze, because copper is more easily extracted from the ore at lower temperatures, and then iron is a much higher, temperature process, 1500 or so. So with the crucible steel, actually, what they were doing is again firing the wrought iron along with the carbonaceous materials at very high, temperatures, because they would have at least, it would have been highly reducing, at least 1300 or so. Well, that's also why the iron technology is a lot more sophisticated than copper, because you also need to have, the shaft furnace, but also it needs to be a very reducing, conditions for there to be enough carbon monoxide and so on. So how were they doing it? Well, this is the beauty of it, that this was all happening, at times before even, writing or written down. But of course, at one level, although we are getting, these early dates for iron, let's say in Tamil Nadu and all that, when you look at the record in Anatolia, of course, you do get, a lot of the records of the Hittites, under whom actually it was thought. And you're getting very early dates also in Anatolia, like 2000 BC or so. And there, the interesting aspect, of course, is you're finding, these references to Anbar and so on. One, of course, is the meteoritic iron. They were also using meteoritic iron because that was available also close to Egypt, and the smelted iron. But I mean, the fact is that we know when you look at the Agaria who've been smelting iron, and that is the interesting aspect, that the metal workers, a lot of them, so I'm saying that in let's say maybe in the Anatolian context, there may have been an urbanized context in which, iron smelting and all that was flourishing. But even if you look at Africa, there was, in Africa also, even though the dates were not that early, But again, iron smelting was going on in what was not necessarily a very urbanized context. Because I remember somebody came up and asked this question and said that, how can you say that they were, that iron smelting, was used so early in Tamil Nadu, because it didn't actually cause that kind of transformation that you might see, for instance, in the Anatolian context. I mean, the so-called civilizational transformation and whatever. And all. But you can use it like at a subsistence sort of level. We've seen that in Africa, where there's iron smelting that's been going on, which is in a kind of subsistence context. And, and also a lot of the communities that have practiced it traditionally, the Agaria, the Asurs, I mean, they are from these, what we call indigenous communities, the Kurumbas or the Kotas and the blacksmiths. They are from these nomadic, itinerant, communities. It's not that it's always a kind of very urban elite context, but they had the skills and they had the empirical knowledge. So, this is possible, and that's what happened. We have to give credence and credit for that as well.
Hi, I'm Sneha. I'm a product designer. I have two very beginner level questions. Firstly, how does one even realize that there's a possible excavation site right beneath our feet? Maybe there's something right here. So how do you even realize that in the first place? And secondly, in Kiradi, was it under a certain dynasty that we are aware of? And if so, are there any remnants of that?
First 2 chapters of my book. Please buy it.
Good job.
See, I've learned I'm less shy in the 1.5 hours we've spent. It's a long process of finding an excavation site. It starts with an exploration, from what I've understood. And a whole team leaves an office and they identify where they want to go. And then they, in this case, it was pretty much a drive along the Vaigai River. So they decided that they want to look at Tamil Nadu, and then they wanted to find clues about Madurai. So it really came from a place of trying to understand this ancient city. And the team started from the upper reaches of the Vaigai and went all the way to downstream. So along the way, they mapped every single thing. They call it a human scanning exercise. So they go from one place to the other and they look. By that, it's not they scan humans, but they are scanning others. And I think along the way, they found a whole bunch of interesting things, and everything is noted down, everything is documented. In this particular case, it was somebody in the 70s had already sort of, tipped off that Kiladi was an interesting place, because this was now a retired teacher, and he had this idea of sending his students out on exploration. So imagine little kids in school uniforms just running around this village, because in his opinion, you need to know your village. That's the starting point, should be where you live. So those kids came back to him with a whole bunch of terracotta figurines and coins and a skull. And so for a few days, the skull lived with this teacher and his wife. And he sort of is still, lives in that area. So when Mr. Amarnath Ramakrishna and his ASI team went looking, they met this teacher and they asked him, do you remember where your students picked up these things from? And in that process, they end up in a coconut grove. They find all these potsherds on the ground, and start noting it down as, oh, this is an interesting site. It has so many potsherds, so likely it's a habitation site. And then sort of come back to it several times and finally narrow it down as a place they want to excavate. So as an archaeologist in India, you can't just show up and start digging. You need to apply for a license to North India, to the ASI headquarters, where there's a team of people who sit and look through all the documents that you submit to them and see if there's a site that has potential. So that's how it's identified. Your second question was, is it on top of or below a dynasty? Is that what you said? I mean, I think the closest would be the Pandyas, but the early Pandyas during the Sangam time. And one of the conjectures was next to Kiladi is a place called Manalur that could have been where senior Pandya officials once sort of were stationed. So that whole area was very historically significant. But you can't dig in Madurai right now. That's a big problem because it's so filled with habitation and filled with people. So it's impossible to push them all out and look below their houses. And because Madurai is expanded so much, whatever was there would have likely been sort of clawed away by JCB machines already to build new houses. So I think this is how it's a very long process of how you identify a site. And And along the way, I won't give it away, so do read the book, please. But there are people who show up to like help them find this as well. So,
And of course, the Pandyan reference, even the Ashokan edict, Shahbaz Gari edict talks about the Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyans. So you know that they were, and the connection also with Madurai in some of the Sangam literature. So that that dynastic connection with the Pandyans, I suppose, is something remains.
One last question.
Yeah, hi. Gautam here, a scientist from Nimans. So, piggybacking from the other scientist, do you find intermediate samples of the metal so that you can look at how the refinement or the forgery process is? And because there were samples of cholesterol found in the urns, do you think there was oil quenching of these metals? And I do have a question for you. So, one way to look at the samples of rice and meat found in the urns, it could be that it's spoiled and that's what killed the person. So that's why they buried both of them together. So do you think they studied the microbes? So do you think they studied the microbes in these samples? And another thing is, as a writer, can you differentiate between a ritualistic burial and then something that is scientific, to safeguard the rest of the settlement from eating spoiled food?
Yeah, well, that is a very interesting, idea because, I mean, in fact, in some records and things, for instance, even, Varahamira and also on talks about quenching by, by stabbing a person and so on. So there are all these various ways of doing it. I mean, you have to understand that in a way, like what's been accomplished so far is in a way a beginning. It's a process. There's still so much more to do. I mean, even it's just very preliminary, even to get samples. Even now, I've been using an XRF because it's totally non-destructive. Everybody's really paranoid about giving us samples in the first place to analyze. It's only very rarely we've been able to persuade them, or there's some dislodged pieces. So I think even the scientific studies are very much in the it's still evolving. But this is certainly a very interesting idea. I mean, maybe we but the problem being that with the iron, of course, it's so very rusted, and then you get a lot of the siliceous material and all that in. So how you could actually check whether there is the remnants of but oil quenching, there's no reason why they couldn't have been experimenting with different forms of quenching and so on, which some of I don't want to go into all the textual stuff, but there's certainly evidence that they could have been doing that. And how early on, but there's no reason. But this would be very interesting, of course, if we could get more studies. And I would love your ideas and support in that. Thank you.
I have no idea whether they died of eating spoiled food. I will let you know if I find out. Thank you.
But I think there may have been more of the feeding the afterlife, right? That seems more the logical thing, simply because it just reminds you of what the Egyptians were doing and things. So, yeah.